Today we're starting our discussion of Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Yesterday we had our graded discussion about salvation and the reading from the text, and we talked a little bit about, I guess, the impact of religion and some of the religious rhetoric. Today we're talking about the religion that formed our country in Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, and specifically discussing the Great Awakening, which I know you've also been talking about in AP US history. So, this is Jonathan Edwards, and if you've read Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, now you can picture the person who's saying those words in front of you. We're going to talk a little bit about his background information. Jonathan Edwards was born the fifth of 11 children, and the interesting thing about him is that he attended Yale College in 1716. He turned 13 2 months into his attending of Yale. So he was a 12-year-old kid when he first started at Yale University. And one of the reasons that he was so advanced for his age is because he believed that once school was over, like today, for example, at 2:35 or 2:40, when you got out of school, he believed that in order to keep up with your religious and your regular education, secular education, you needed to study 13 hours a day. As I mentioned before, he had an important role in the Great Awakening, which in this country, like the time period for that is around 1730 to 1755. And he was the grandfather of Aaron Burr, who was one of our first United States senators elected in 1791. In 1800, he ran for the U.S. presidency but was unsuccessful and became vice president instead under Thomas Jefferson. But what he's known for the most today, thanks to the musical Hamilton, is that he is the man who, in a duel in 1804, shot and killed Alexander Hamilton. So Jonathan Edwards was his grandfather. It gives you a little bit of information about the influence that this family had on the early forming of the United States of America. The Great Awakening was a religious revival that swept New England. Jonathan Edwards' start in it was in 1740. A man named George Whitefield, who was a well-known British evangelist, joined together with Jonathan Edwards to spark this revival that swept across New England. It was basically what I refer to as a backlash religious movement, because many people believed that the church had grown far too lenient in how it treated sinners and referred to sinners. And so Jonathan Edwards formed something known as Calvinism, which stressed the idea of predestination, which is basically a belief that only a few people are chosen by God and can be saved, and that no individual could earn this salvation by doing good deeds, so everyone was powerless to control their own fate, which makes it kind of interesting when you discuss what he's saying in the sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Jonathan Edwards has something that he kind of includes as a fire and brimstone tradition of a speech. And basically that's referencing the fiery pits of hell and the brimstone, the rocks that are hotter than hell and the hellfire itself, to scare people, like these images of fire and scaring and hell and things like that, to scare people into doing what he wanted them to do, and in this case to kind of aim for salvation. And so if you ever hear that someone is speaking of fire and brimstone speech, that's a direct reference to Jonathan Edwards, whose speech style basically coined that phrase. If you've never been in a sermon before, or to a church sermon before, I'm going to teach you a little bit about some of the sermon rhetorical strategies that people use. The first literary element or rhetorical strategy is considered something called a focus text or a reading. So when you're presenting a sermon, typically you begin with a verse from the Bible, could be multiple verses from the Bible, that explain what point it is or lesson you want to get across. So Jonathan Edwards' point or sermon verse is, "Their foot shall slide in due time," from Deuteronomy 32:35. And so basically, if you take a look at the first page of his sermon, he uses that text to enumerate points that he wants to make. He basically breaks it down and explains what each of those words mean. Their foot shall slide and due time, and kind of discusses each of those so that we get a better understanding of the focus text itself before he moves on to the actual point of his sermon. Within his sermon, he uses a lot of different techniques. One is metaphor. I'm sure you know what a metaphor is, but what you may not understand is that metaphors are considered rhetorically stronger than similes, because similes, the connectives of like and as, soften the metaphor. So when you say a man is a spider spinning above the fiery pits of hell, instead of you say a man is like a spider spinning his web above the fiery pits of hell, the like softens it a little bit, so the metaphor is considered a stronger rhetorical technique. Not that similes are bad, just that metaphors are a little bit stronger. Another element that he uses is repetition, whether it's repetition of sounds, like through alliteration, repetition of initial consonant sounds, assonance, repetition of internal vowel sounds, consonants, repetition of internal or ending consonant sounds, whether it's repetition of words like anaphora at the start of successive phrases, anadiplosis at the end of one phrase and the beginning of another, or antistrophe at the end of successive phrases, or whether it's the repetition of words through something like diacope, where a single word is stressed multiple times and repeated multiple times, with different words in between and with no set pattern, or if it's phrase repetition or line repetition or even idea repetition. So for example, como ratio is the use of repetition of the same idea but using different words to describe it. And sermons use this kind of thing all the time, mostly to call attention to particular ideas, because you're only listening to a sermon, you're not reading it. So you can't really go back and try to kind of see what the idea was, and hopefully the speaker makes his point well known enough through repetition that you're not having to. I put sinners in the hands of an angry God through a cloud generator of repetition of words, and you can take a look at this graph and kind of see that some of our main words are God, hell, men, any moment, wicked, one. Early in the sermon, it's slippery and destruction and power, but you can see some of those words and what kind of connotations that they might hold to get an idea of the tone of the sermon. Another very important literary element in sermons is imagery. So word pictures that create an emotional response through sensory details. And when we talk about sensory details, we're really talking about words that evoke and appeal to the five senses: sight, sound, smell, touch, or taste. And so within Jonathan Edwards' sermon, there's a lot of those different sensory images. Let me give you a couple. Indeed, these things are nothing. If God should withdraw his hand, they would avail no more than to keep you from falling than the thin air to hold a person up that is suspended in it. So again, the image of a person suspended in thin air is a really important image to this piece. There's this one: all your righteousness would have no more influence to uphold you than keep you out of hell than a spider's web would have to stop a falling rock. And you get a really clear vision of like the effort or the lack of effort it would take to have someone fall down into hell. And then this is one of my favorites. The bow of God's wrath is bent, and the arrow made ready on the string. And justice bends the arrow at your heart and strains the bow, and it is nothing but the mere pleasure of God, and that of an angry God, without any promise or obligation at all, that keeps the arrow one moment from being made drunk with your blood. There's so many images in that one quote alone, but they're really particular as far as the sermon itself. So this is just the start of some of the things that we're going to be discussing with Jonathan Edwards' sermon. We're also going to talk a little bit about diction level and syntax variation in order to create our own sermons. But that's just a start. Have a good day.